Welcome back. Today we're getting into Chapter 2 of our CCT-250 course, TCP IP review. Now, for those of you who have taken, Net 125 or any other introductory networking course, some of this stuff will be refresher, but I mean, that's the whole point of review, right? I want to make sure everybody's got a nice firm footing so that we can move forward into understanding how to manipulate networking. So we're going to look at some fundamental TCP IP concepts and technologies related to networking. We're going to review the OSI reference model, 7 layers, and the TCP IP model, either 4 layers or 5, depending on your definition. We're going to look at some common protocols and how they're used, and we're also going to look at some common TCP IP attacks. So here is the OSI reference model. This is a very simple table. Just shows us the 7 layers in order from top to bottom, top being layer 7 and layer 1 being the bottom. So the OSI reference model is mainly used today as a reference model and effective means of teaching distributed communication. One of the biggest things to be aware of regarding the OSI is how each individual layer should be able to operate independently but compatibly. So it's an interesting dance that has to be carried out. OSI functions in a predictable and structured fashion designed to ensure compatibility and reliability. And each layer is tasked with carrying out a discrete group of operations. Discrete just meaning that they are able to be identified separately. So we have application, presentation, session, transport, network link, and physical. Now, something I want to draw attention to is layer 2. You can see here that they have this kind of branch that is drawn off the side. This is important because the data link layer is the transition between the logical aspects of the OSI above layer 2 and the physical aspects of the OSI below layer 2. So layer 2 is kind of a transitory space, and that's why we have the logical link control and the media access control. .3PO here will help us to talk about protocols. Protocol is rule for communication. That's the long and short of it. It's an agreed upon set of rules through which we communicate. So when 3PO states that he is a protocol droid and that he's fluent in over 6 million forms of communication, it is because he is able to take the core concept of each language involved in the communication and find equivalencies. And that's what protocols do, is they find ways to say, you pronounce it this way, I pronounce it this way, I'm going to find an equivalency so that we both understand in analogous terms. This allows dissimilar systems to be able to communicate quickly, easily, and efficiently. Not only that, but it is reproducible, which is essential for science. I believe it's Ken Norris that was quoted as saying the scientific method is nothing but a series of rules to keep us from lying to each other. So the physical layer does 3 primary things. It transmits info to and from systems. It reveals how much and how long information is going to be sent, but it does not reveal understanding of the info being transmitted. So it's all just the physicality of the information. We take the signal that has been generated digitally in the software side and then convert it into something that is able to be sent as an analog signal. So that can be light pulses if we're talking about fiber optics, electrical impulses if we're talking about standard copper lines, and then radio frequencies if we're talking about Wi-Fi transmission or Bluetooth transmission. And then, of course, decoding that on the opposite end. Physical layer characteristics would be things like voltage levels, data rates, the maximum transmission distance of the medium, timing of voltage changes, which we can talk about later when we deal with side channel attacks, physical connectors and adapters to be able to allow different things to interface, and the topology or physical layout of the network. Now that is a term that you're going to see quite a bit, which is topology. Topology just means arrangement or layout. We'll talk about it sometimes in the context of it being physical, sometimes being logical. So it's important to just understand that it means, it's an organizational structure. The data link layer, as I talked about earlier, being that transitory layer between logical and physical, has a couple of pieces of vocabulary that I want to make sure that we're very comfortable with. The first one being frame. In networking, frame is a container into which data is placed for transmission and delivery. It allows us to have that whole discrete aspect of transmission. Now, this is a standard for Ethernet frame version 2. So Ethernet 2 is often how we refer to it with current frames. The standard for Ethernet is defined by the IEEE. IEEE is an international organization that handles all kinds of consensus-driven standards. Specifically, the one we're going to talk about in here is either going to be 802.3, specifically for Ethernet, 802.11 for Wi-Fi, et cetera, et cetera. Flow control. This is the mechanism that manages data flow between nodes. What I mean by this is we're trying to make sure that what is being transmitted does not exceed the capability of a given physical connection to receive. When you were a kid, I'm sure you played with, a water hose or something similar, and you would find that, if you squeezed the trigger really hard, it would spray out really fast. If you try to squeeze it a little bit, it would go slower. So that lever that allowed the handle to function controlled how much water was passing through at any given time. Now, if we look at water as a non-compressible substance, which it is, then we realize that the only way for the same volume of water to pass through the same space in a given period of time is to increase its speed. So when we're talking about electricity, when we're talking about data, it's traditionally we have to change the speed, not necessarily the content, because the MTU, or maximum transmission unit, of an Ethernet connection or similar is usually going to be fixed around about 1,500 bytes. So it's important to understand that we say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and send a little bit more slowly, or I'm going to change the size of the frame if necessary to be able to send things out. ARP, this is the protocol responsible for translating IPv4 addresses to a previously unknown MAC. So if you've seen this before, it's not unlike DNS in that we translate a domain name into an IP address. It's just in this case we're talking about local physical devices to be able to do neighbor-based exchanges. Is this part of our local network? Is this part of a remote network? Or in more technical terms, is it inside or outside of our autonomous system, or AS? That is a term we will see again. The network layer, as you might imagine, gets into the logical side of things. This is addressing, this is routing of traffic. So not only is this the assignment and maintenance of IP addresses, but this is being able to organize them in such a way as to subdivide a network into its correct segments and be able to route traffic appropriately. IP addresses are logical, non-persistent items. So they are assigned via software. They're changed as needed, traditionally through DHCP. Now, if you have static IPs, that's a little bit different, but again, they're assigned by software and they have to be reassigned every time you reboot. They are used to route traffic to different areas of a network, and it assists in network segmentation. For those of you who may not be as familiar or need a slightly clearer definition, network segmentation is what you see here in the graphic on the right. So you see that there is a router. The traditional icon for a router is a kind of a round disk that has arrows pointing in and out. Okay, if we saw that in a square form, we would see that as a switch. And in some cases, you may also see what's called a multi-layer switch, which is a little bit different. It has like 6 arrows on it instead of 4. Then at the bottom, we see that we have either servers or end devices of some kind. So what we're seeing is that we go from one router into 4 quote-unquote sub-routers. Now, a sub-router is not really a thing so much as it's just establishing the hierarchy. It's the verticality of the network. So if we go from the 10.0 IP that's at the top, that means that everything that is below that router should have a 10.0 prefix. Then we have the third octet that starts getting filled up, the third block separated by decimals here in the next layer as .0, .1, .2, and .3. Everything inside of those will also have that prefix plus whatever subprefix is there. So if we look at the second one, 10.0.1.x, that means that everything in that third layer beneath that router should be 10.0.1.1.2.3, so on and so forth. It's important to understand data manipulation at this layer, and it's also important to understand how can we implement controls to be able to stop it. This is where a lot of manipulation occurs from the attacker standpoint, so we must be exceptionally vigilant. The transport layer, layer 4, is going to ensure that data is completely and correctly sent. So we want to make sure when we're talking about things like TCP, which is a connection-oriented protocol that is built on the basis of I'm going to get the info to you. It's going to be correct. It's going to be in the right order. All the content is going to be. It's going to have integrity. Remember our CIA triad we talked about in Chapter 1. So in order to do this, we're going to enforce error recovery and flow control. So error recovery means we're going to have to be able to look at a transmission and say, does this match? Does it have integrity? And then flow control is going to be able to allow us to speed or slow the rate of transmission by adjusting the number of bits transmitted per submission sequence. Like the data link layer, it guarantees a link between stations in the delivery of data and is responsible for communicating between hosts. It has to verify that the sender and recipient are ready to initiate data transfer. Usually through with TCP, we have handshaking, basically saying, are you there? Yes, I'm there. Okay, I'm going to transmit. Go ahead and transmit back and forth. There's a lot of preamble. There's a lot of overhead. And we'll see later on that there's a big difference between TCP and UDP because of that overhead. Speaking of, here's a nice little graphic to show you that TCP and UDP really just kind of differ in being connection oriented or not, and then having reliability or not. The session layer. Connections have to be created, managed, and terminated. So the session layer is responsible for those 3 steps in any given connection. If we have to have a connection between TCP, for example, we're going to make sure that that creation and teardown occurs properly and we don't have any open sessions that can then be hijacked. The session layer includes protocols like RPC, Remote Procedure Call, SSH, Secure Shell, and the Network File System, or NFS. The presentation layer is exactly what it sounds like. When I was a kid, I absolutely loved Flintstone's holiday Christmas Carol thing. In order to make extra money for himself to buy presents for Wilma and Pebbles, Fred goes and works as a Santa in a local department store, and he's working at the gift wrap counter at one point, and he has this really just janky job that he did on this woman's umbrella, and she looks at him and goes, "Do you call this gift wrapped?" And he stares at it for a second, and it kind of wiggles and pops, and when it does, it turns into the kind of this weird inverted bouquet to where it's absolutely gorgeous. And he's like, "Yes, I do." And that's something that kind of sticks with me when we talk about the presentation layer. Human beings look at how things are packaged when we look at computers, and it doesn't necessarily make sense because it doesn't tell a story. Human beings are narrative creatures. We have to remember that. We like stories. We like things to make narrative sense. So when we see things that don't necessarily make narrative sense, but they function, there is a weird dissonance with that. Evolutionary biology talks about this. There's AI that has issues with that. There are lots of different functions that work in a particular way, and they work very efficiently, but they don't necessarily tell a story. So we have difficulty with that. So just be aware that there are things that you may see at the application layer that don't seem to make sense, but they provide the packaging or formatting necessary to be able to allow different systems, which is the whole point. We want to be able to provide them in a way that different systems can say, "Oh, I know what that is. Oh, I get it." And even though Fred Flintstone did it on accident, doesn't mean that he didn't do it. Gateway services. This is a term that we'll come up with on occasion. This is how we send and receive data between different networks that use different protocols. So again, it just kind of facilitates what I was talking about. Encryption and decryption services. This is something that's important. The ability to keep information confidential and verify the integrity of information. This is an important point to stop and kind of think about how encryption and decryption work. We have keys or some other form of verification that we say, I'm going to change this information using this, and if you have the correct key on the opposite side, you should be able to decrypt that and return it to its original clear text revision, being able to see what it is. So the presentation layer will sometimes have those keys passed to it by the application layer to be able to perform this service. So again, it needs to be able to communicate between layers, but still remain autonomous in terms of what I do is here. I know I do a lot of pop culture references, but it kind of helps you understand there are a lot of things in the world that operate exactly the same way computer science does. Paul Gauguin and Ernest Hemingway partnered for a while creatively. And whenever Mr. Hemingway would start kind of straying out of his lane, Gauguin would remind him, you write, I paint. And a very, tacit and just kind of a jibe to be like, do what you do best. I'll do what I do best. And that's what OSI layers are all about. It's not that we couldn't write this big omni layer that handles everything, but that's not efficient. And it also doesn't allow us to explore the capabilities of each layer to where we can kind of test and see, can we make this more efficient? Can we make this better? And when we get to the TCP comparison in a little bit, the layer models anyway, we'll see how that manifests. Last but certainly not least, the first one we tend to see, which it does tend to confuse people because we write these things from the top down, layer 7 to layer 1, application, what we see to the physical, people are like, well, shouldn't the application layer be layer 1 and the physical layer be at the bottom? Not necessarily the case, because the finished product, it's the exact same thing, but reversed in the opposite direction. So the number really is kind of arbitrary, and it's more important to understand the workflow than it is to get the right quote-unquote number. Now, we obviously need to know the numbers because that way we have that common vocabulary that I was talking about before. We have the ability to express, hey, you and I are talking about the same thing. I know what you're talking about. You know what I'm talking about. We can get the job done, right? So the application layer gives us the ability to support several services used by applications as well as other services. That's something else that you'll see in computer science is a lot of recursion, services about services and things like that. The point at which applications access network services is layer 7. This is like user mode for the OSI. A way that I have heard it described before is that imagine you have a microwave, and that is an application that you could put to any number of different uses. You could, heat up a bowl of soup or whatever else. The application layer is the outlet from which the microwave draws its power. It assumes that the outlet is the correct shape, correct connection, and it has the correct voltage and amperage. If we did not have those things, it's entirely possible that we could damage the microwave or overcook or undercook our food or possibly harm ourselves. There's a ton of things that could happen there. So we have to make sure that what's being fed from layer to layer makes sense and is packageable appropriately. If we look on the right, the graphic kind of helps illustrate what I'm talking about. You see that we have the application layer up at the top, and we have a little block that says data. This is our payload. This is the final piece of data to be able to pass through. If we move down a layer towards the physical, we get to transport. Transport is now where we're going to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and encapsulate this. Encapsulation is the name of the term for this, into another piece of data segment called a UDP segment. Okay. So segmentation of data, cutting up the payload in pieces. The UDP data is the application data from the layer above put into kind of like a little bubble, and then there's a header that's put on the front of it that can be read for information to describe what's inside. And we repeat the process. We go down to the internet layer. Again, this is the TCP IP model, so this is going to merge. Instead of having the network layer, we're going to have the internet layer instead. We're going to have IP data, so this is our logical addressing. Which is going to be the transport segment from before, but now it has a header on it for IP level information. Then we pass that further down, and this is where the link layer is, or physical access, and this is representative of the data link and physical layers. So TCP IP model, which I'll show you in just a minute, is a little bit reductive, but it follows the same general pattern. Now we take the information from the IP block. We have that what's called a packet. So we have a segment, we have a packet, and then we have a frame. The frame is where we take that packet data, turn it into frame data, and add a header and a footer. Now, if you look on the left-hand side as you're moving down this stack, you'll see header, header, header. And then when we get to the very bottom, we're going to go ahead and attach that footer. Okay, so in the header for each of these items, it tells us the length of the data with which we will be processing, but only for the item that's going to be transcoded onto copper wire, fiber optic, radio frequency. That's where we have to put a trailer on the end of it, or a footer. So that's why that frame has both of those pieces. Now, if we want to map the OSI model to different protocols and functions, we can do that. Obviously, I'm not going to insult you by thinking that you can't read, so I'm going to go ahead and hold on this slide for a little bit, or you can pause it, of course, and take a look at it. But as you can see, there are specific attacks that very easily occur at each of these different sections. Here are also some of the protocols that we'll talk about there. This is just the protocols, not the attacks in particular. So if you look at the previous slide and this one next to one another, I'm sure you can actually start to see where there are some things that overlap a little bit. Like if we look at the transport layer, we see BGP. That's a border gateway protocol. That's the only exterior gateway protocol that we have. And then we have, of course, in the network layer, ones that we're probably a little bit more comfortable with, like iGrip. And then we have OSPF, Open Shortest Path First, and then RIP. So there's a couple that are there. Those are essentially the protocols of local versus remote networks. Like the protocol of the internet is BGP. So when we see certain types of attacks that are based on external to internal translation access, BGP, that's going to be a big target. Facebook had that big issue with their servers going kind of awry, their BGP servers, and then boop, half the internet seems to go down because so many people rely on Facebook for their authentication systems through OpenAuth and things like that. So this is going to show us the TCP model mapped to the OSI. So we talked before about application presentation session. Whatever mnemonic that you need in order to remember those layers in order, I suggest just grab some flashcards, write them down. I'm trying to remember the one that was taught to me originally, and it was awful, but I remembered it because it was so cheesy. But it was people don't never throw sausage pizza away. And again, it was not grammatically correct either, so I'm sure there's some variations there that make a little bit more sense. But in any event, we need to be aware of that granularity because, as you can see, there are some things that get merged over. As we move over to the TCP model, you can see here that we have our physical model. That's going to be data link and physical. Sometimes that's called network access. Layer 2 is interchangeably going to either be called the network layer or the internet layer. Then you have your host to host, and then you have application up at the top. Sometimes layers 5 through 7 are lumped together, and then transport is left as its own thing. There's a couple of different variations, but this is one that we're going to talk about in here. So just bear in mind that if you see some variations of this, it's the same general concept, but it streamlines parts of it because there are certain things that we don't do in TCP IP-based communications on the internet that we do have to be aware of in non-internet based transactions. So let's look at some physical or network access layer hardware. We've got repeaters, hubs, bridges, switches. Repeaters extend the range of a network, whether it's wired or wireless. All it does is take in a signal and regenerate it. Hubs do something similar, but it's connected to multiple nodes rather than just one. Usually repeaters are in, out, one input, one output. With hubs, you usually have like one input and like 4 or 5 outputs. Hubs are not used very often anymore. They're also sometimes called dumb switches because they don't have the CAM, the content addressable memory that a switch does to be able to keep track of who's connected to what port. Bridge is going to be a physical joiner between two network segments. It's going to be allowing us to kind of take two segments and feed them into the same upper level hierarchy. And then the switch, which is one you're probably going to deal with most often, is what transitions traffic between internal and external autonomous systems. So if you and one of your classmates each have your own kind of private little networks that you're dealing with. To be able to allow them to communicate with one another, the switch has to be able to pass information upwards into a router, more often than not, to be able to transition that. So let's look at some protocols that these devices are going to use. ARP, Address Resolution Protocol. There's also reverse ARP, or RARP. You say some of these protocols and you feel just absolutely silly, but that's what we got to do. Neighbor Discovery Protocol, NDP. This one's a little bit different because it's not like reverse NDP, it's inverse NDP. And even then, we don't do the full 4 letters, we just do 3, so it's IND. Transport Layer Security, TLS. You've probably heard about TLS when you're talking about websites that have secure connectivity. Layer 2 Tunneling Protocol, or L2TP. Point-to-point Protocol, or PPP. Or triple P in certain cases, and serial line interface, or SLIP. Common attacks on layer 1 will be spoofing MACs, poisoning MAC address resolution, basically trying to impersonate a device that should be receiving traffic, wiretapping, interception, and eavesdropping. To countermand against this, fiber optics, which are very hard to try and eavesdrop on in most cases. WEP is a countermeasure, but it's very easily broken, so do not use it. Wi-Fi protected access, a little bit deprecated now. WPA2, which is the improved version. WPA3 is considered to be much better, but it has not been as widely adopted. The devices that it needs to have out and about have not been adopted as widely. So over the next couple of years, you're going to see WPA3 become more and more prevalent. Point-to-point tunneling protocol, or PPTP, and then CHAP, Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol. These are some things that work against some of the attacks at layer 1 to improve the security of the protocols listed in the far left column. Now, a router, I talked about that earlier when we were talking about bridging items, trying to move between physical aspects of a network. These are also physical, but they don't forward broadcast packets like a switch would. They forward multicast packets, which are basically subscriber groups. If you've ever had a class activity where your instructor broke you up into teams, it may be that you have like 4 different teams, and like team 1 gets a certain piece of information, team 2 gets a second piece, etc. These are going to have the highest level of latency because there's the highest level of processing being involved, but they do also have the most flexibility because they're able to move traffic between different networks. They do require configuration to operate correctly, whereas switches can be either managed or unmanaged. So a switch can just be plug and play, or you can go in and configure it to have a VLAN interface and all of these various things. The router is your primary piece of equipment at the network or internet layer, so it has to be configured appropriately. Now, we will use logical addresses to direct traffic to lower layers as opposed to physical addresses, because if we were keeping the physical addresses, it would actually become even harder to maintain any form of low latency. We talked about these protocols just a little bit ago, so I'll give you a little bit of extra information there. Routing Information Protocol, or RIP, is a distance vector routing protocol. If we remember vectors from math class, we're talking about something that has both direction and magnitude, which means that it is traveling in a given direction at a particular speed. So based on the links between different network segments, it will calculate what is the best route to take. OSPF, Open Shortest Path First, is the most common link state routing protocol. It identifies whether or not a particular aspect of the network is active before attempting to connect to it in very general terms. ISIS, intermediate system to intermediate system. This is a link state IGP, interior gateway. It's used to distribute routing information through a single AS in an IP network. IGRIP, which is Enhanced Interior Gateway Routing Protocol. Dynamic routing, changes on the fly as needed to, if something drops out. There's what's called the convergence time, which is how long it takes to find an alternative route. And then with BGP, I beat BGP over the head a couple of minutes ago. Dynamic routing protocol, this is the routing protocol of the internet. When we're talking about top level TLDs, ISP communication, things like that, international communication, this is BGP based. That is the big bad. Unfortunately, we're putting all of our eggs in one basket because we use one protocol for this, but the nature of the internet requires that we have that commonality. So it is both a good thing and a very, very dangerous thing. Now, to ensure that traffic gets to the correct destination, routers are going to examine packet headers in order to determine the target address. Once we get the packet, the router is going to examine the header of that packet with specific evidence on the target address, excuse me. Once the target address is obtained, the router consults a routing table to determine where to send the information. And then with IPv4, the router will examine the IPv6 header to determine the target address. So it's very, very similar. The only difference is that IPv6 obviously has a significantly longer set of addresses and then changes some of the fields, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. TCP has several fields in the header to give us flow control and error checking, things like that. UDP has a significant reduction of this overhead, but it loses that reliability. So if we look at the bottom right corner, you'll see that over 160 bits, there's all kinds of options and things like that that can be there, the padding. If we look at UDP, we've got 4 fields, comes up to 32 bits total. We've got, 64 bits total. So it's a significant reduction, but it doesn't have the ability to say, oh, you got this particular section wrong, so we're going to move on to the retry process. We're going to resubmit. Now, when we talk about OSPF, which is probably one of the most common interior routing protocols, we've got some advantages to check off. It's more secure in general. We can use multicasting to send out router updates. We have an unlimited hop count. It's better for load balancing. It's better for convergence. Convergence, like I said, is just finding a new path if one goes, one of the devices goes down. In order to figure out how this works, we use what's called link state. Link state calculates the best path by multiple metrics, so things like delay, speed, administrative weight, bandwidth. Once we figure this out, the router tells other routers in its immediate vicinity, and that gets passed across other routers in the same sphere. So link state routing is considered more flexible and robust than distance vector, because distance vector does not calculate based on the overall structure of the network in a given area. And for most large-scale deployments, OSPF is the traditional replacement for RIP or RIP-v2. In IPv4, Internet Protocol version 4, we have addresses that are written in 32-bit length, and they are 4 bytes in that case. So 32 over 8, there's 8 bits in a byte, gives us 4 bytes. So we write them in a 4-block format, but we don't use binary because that's harder for humans to read. So we convert it into a decimal number representable from 0 to 255. You have an 8-bit binary number, it's all ones, 8 ones, that is representative of 255. And in order to determine what class our particular IP address belongs to, we want to look at our first octet, which is what we call that first dotted decimal block. So if we're going between 1 and 126, that's class A. 127 to 191 is a class B. 192 to 223 is a C. 224 to 239 is a D. Those tend to be multicast, tend to be fairly limited. And then class E, oddly enough experimental, none of the other letters line up this way, is 240 to 255. Now if we look at the private addresses, which is the bottom right graphic here, these are non-routable. They're private use, designed for internal consumption for companies. So if you've ever bought a router, most likely you have a class C predefined address, 192.168.0.1 probably. In some cases you'll have like 1.1 or 2.1. It just depends. So traffic cannot be passed from private addresses onto the internet directly. They have to be transitioned through the use of a subnet mask. So the subnet mask is just going to be a block of ones that's used to identify what portion is considered to be the network ID, and what portion is considered to be the host ID. IPv6 enhances IPv4's functionality by changing the way that subnets are performed, simply because subnets are not really necessary in IPv6. 128 bits, we have 4 times the length. Now, if you follow binary mathematics, you'll know that by adding a single bit, you double the number of addresses. So we go from about 4.3 billion addresses in IPv4 to like 38 undecillion addresses in IPv6. And we also now have, instead of the dot notation, we use colons, and we separate the addresses with those colons, but to make them more easily read, instead of having a block of 16 ones and zeros, we're going to convert them into hex. Now, if you haven't done hex math, we're going to play with that, but you have to remember that we have 4 bits to represent one hexadecimal value, because hexadecimal, hexa meaning 6, decimal meaning 10. We're talking about 16 individual values per character. We have to start with 0. We have to have that blank concept, state of tabula rasa, if you will. So we go from 0 to 15. But we can't represent 10 through 15 as single characters using traditional numerals like that. So we have to involve some letters. So 10 becomes A, 11 becomes B, up to 15 being F. So we have 0 through 9, and then A, B, C, D, E, F representing 0 through 15. The packet headers have been simplified in order to reduce a little bit of the overhead, because we are transmitting more data just for the header itself. And we have some built-in security with good old IPv6. Now let's take a look at an example of this address so you can see what I'm talking about. 2600:1700:0131 1BA0:4894 D6FA :7E7E :75CF. That's a lot, right? Now in this particular case, we can't show the compression that's capable because we don't have a lot of 0 blocks. But the one thing I will point out to you is in the third hextet, which is what they call these blocks, 0131 could just be written as 131. And this is because, just as it is in standard mathematics that we're used to with decimal base, zeros in the front don't matter, leading zeros don't matter, just trailing zeros. So if I were to write, 8 zeros in front of a 1, it doesn't change the magnitude of the 1 at all. If I write 8 zeros after a 1, then obviously that is a very different matter. 100 million versus 1 is all in the placement of the zeros versus the 1 in relation to the decimal point. ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol. The graphic on the right here shows us the most common ICMP types. ICMP was originally a diagnostic and logical error reporting tool. ICMP is essential for network management and provides error reporting and diagnostics. There are 2 current versions, ICMP v4 for IPv4 and then version 6 for IPv6. Pings are probably the most common ICMP tool that's used because it is the packet internet groper. One of the weirdest names I've heard in tech stuff. There are some others that are out there too. But what it does is essentially it's a game of Marco Polo. You up? Yep, cool. And then we get some metrics on, is there any degradation of the transmission? Are we losing any packets? Is there a long delay? Things like that. So if we have ICMP type 0, that's an echo reply. If we have type 8, that is an echo request. Problems with IP. Okay, sniffers. They are able to observe traffic passing across their interface because in order to allow networks to work, traffic has to be able to examine what's on the network and say, is this mine? No, I'm going to pass it on. Is this mine? Yes, I'm going to go ahead and interpret it. Hardware or software-based devices that view or record traffic flows over the network, those are sniffers. So sensitive data could possibly be viewed. Promiscuous mode on your NIC, network interface, is going to allow a sniffer to capture any packet that it can see. Widely used is going to be Wireshark. So you will have some stuff that you're going to work with that's going to involve Wireshark, filtering traffic, all of those lovely things there. If you haven't used Wireshark before, it's really not that difficult to get used to. It's just a lot of filtration, knowing how to use the different commands and stuff, and I'll be throwing you guys a cheat sheet at some point, I am sure. Some controls that we use to defend ourselves at the internet layer, network layer. IPsec, packet filters, and NAT. These are 3 of the biggest. IPsec is the most widely used standard for protecting IP datagrams. It's integral to IPv6 and keeps data confidential during transit. We've got things like the authentication header, extended security payload or ESP. So we've got a couple of different pieces that help with IPsec to protect IP packets in transit. Packet filters, these are configured through what are called ACLs or access control lists. These are going to be lists of permissions that allow us to block traffic or allow it based on packet headers, kind of like a firewall. Network address translation, this is going to address a need for more IPv4 only devices or addresses for devices, and is used to translate between public and private addresses. Remember I said earlier with routers, we cannot transition internet traffic into a private network or vice versa. We have to have an intermediary. That's where NAT steps in. We're going to have a public IP address usually attached to our primary modem, like cable modem if you have Comcast or Spectrum. And then that translates through your router into your local private address, which can then be used to handle local traffic. Host-to-host layer protocols, this is just a layout of, again, revision of the structure of the TCP frame. The reason I re-included the TCP frame is because I want you to see the relation to the synchronization, acknowledgement, and acknowledgement flags on the right-hand graphic here, where TCP gets started. So you can see that the ACK flag, if you go to the fourth row of the TCP header, just to the right of where it says reserve, you see these 6 little boxes that have some vertical letters in there. You've got erg, ACK, push, reset, SYN, and FIN. So SYN and ACK flags 2 and 4, you can see, are going to be involved in this handshake process to initiate the TCP communication. So SYN, synchronization, is going to say, hey, I need to make a connection. Server is going to say, I acknowledge that you need to make a connection. And then the third piece is, I acknowledge that you acknowledged me. And then we're going to start transmitting. So this is what's called the three-way handshake. Same thing largely happens with the teardown process. Just replace SYN with FIN to finish. So here's a little bit further explanation of these TCP communication flags. You can see finish, no further connections, and then synchronization and acknowledgement down here in the bottom right. We also have urgent, push, and reset. Those are fairly self-explanatory. The one that tends to throw people is urgent versus push. Urgent means the data that you receive with this flag should be processed immediately, and then push says any buffered data that we have, we're going to go ahead and send in. Buffered data just basically meaning stuff that's preloaded. Some host-to-host layer threats would be things like port scanning, session hijacks, synchronization attacks. Port scan is where a message is sent to each port in a group one at a time, and by examining that response, we can find some weaknesses in applications being probed and determine what to attack. And we'll see those again in a couple of chapters. We're going to look at port scans, network scans. Session hijacking, this is where the attacker places themselves between the victim and the server. The reason this works is because authentication is traditionally only done at the start of a TCP session. So you saw the handshake, that's part of the authentication step. But it's not something that's going to be redone throughout the session unless we have another specific layer-based protocol that's going to help us with that. Synchronization attack or SYN attack is a distributed denial of service, also called DDoS attack, in which the attacker sends a succession of SYN packets with a spoofed return address. Now, spoof, if you've not heard that before, is basically just impersonation. So it's a spoofed return address that says there's a targeted destination device that it needs to go to, but it does not send the last ACK packet in order to confirm and acknowledge receipt. Eventually, the target system says, okay, I've got all of my open connections tied up with this system that's sending me SYN packets, but I can't accept any new ones because I don't have any confirmations to be able to close these connections here. And what about timeouts, I hear you ask? Well, if this is done rapidly enough, timeouts don't really play in. And if somebody has a number of different hosts doing this at the same time, again, distributed denial of service means it's distributed across multiple machines. It's very hard to filter illegitimate versus legitimate traffic. Some other controls we want to be aware of are SSL, Secure Sockets Layer, TLS, Transport Layer Security, we brought that up just a little while ago, SOCKS, and then we have Secure RPC or S/RPC, Remote Procedure Call. SSL is an older security-oriented protocol. It's considered application dependent, can be used with HTTP, FTP, Telnet. All of those things can run on top of it transparently. There's a public key cryptography system that is employed in order to operate this, and it's based on the RSA algorithm. When we get into cryptography in another couple of chapters, we're going to talk about RSA, Rivest, Shamir, and Adelman, as well as some other ciphers that Ron Rivest did, like the RC4. Yeah, we'll get into crypto, don't worry. Transport layer security is an upgrade to SSL, is considered backwards compatible, but does not interoperate. So this means that there are two separate things that do very similar items. TLS is designed to be application independent, so it makes it a little bit simpler to try and establish that in a system without having to add all of this extra feature, a lot of extra overhead, of course, to try and make it work. SOX is a security protocol developed and established by what's called RFC 1928. I believe RFC stands for Request for Consensus or Request for Clarification. There are what are called Internet white papers, where people write up the text of how something is supposed to work. So when you see things submitted to the IEEE, they will often refer to RFCs, so that way there can be oversight of what's going on. Again, consensus-driven acceptance of different things. SOX is going to allow us to have client-server applications work when they're separated by one or more firewalls. Secure RPC adds a layer of security onto the RPC process by adding DES, or Data Encryption Standard. DES, of course, is a little bit deprecated at this point. It's still used. More often it's used in the what's called 3DES form, which is where you take a string, encrypt it using DES, take the encrypted string, reprocess it, and then process it for a third time. That's not quite as intricate as AES, which is considered to be a much more advanced form of encryption, but it is still feasible for systems that maybe don't support AES yet because it is more computationally intensive. The application layer. Finally, we have arrived. Again, user mode. This is where we're going to see most of the interaction between us as a user and the system. So some services we might see would be things like DNS. This is going to convert between IP addresses and domain names. So, google.com turns into whatever the IP address is that it uses. We also have File Transfer Protocol, or FTP. That's how we move files from one device to another. If you do upload to a server or download from a server, FTP is going to be involved somewhere. HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, how we sling pages and other information back and forth using hypertext. HTML. SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol, that's how we deal with encryption, over UDP specifically. Telnet is TCP. No encryption intrinsically has to be layered over the top using a supplemental encryption service. Allows us to establish remote connections. SSH is considered to be better as it automatically includes the encryption. SMTP, or Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, is for sending email. And then we have IMAP, IMAP, and then POP for receiving email. Trivial File Transfer Protocol, TFTP, that's config, very tiny stuff. It's a big implementation for UDP because generally it's like, okay, this thing has a small enough overhead that if I have to resend it, it's almost no ding on my bandwidth whatsoever. So configuring a cable modem, setting up the correct QAM or whatever it is that it's using, or router configs, things like that. Some application layer threats that we might see would be things like malware. There's several different categories that we deal with. We've got viruses, worms, spyware, Trojan horses, and ransomware. Remember, the key difference between a virus and a worm is that a virus cannot propagate on its own, whereas a worm can. Worms can be remotely controlled. Spyware is just observed. Trojan horses do not propagate on their own at all. They have to be downloaded from a known source. Usually, piracy is going to be involved at some point there. Somebody downloads a crack of, take a pick, Cyberpunk or No Man's Sky or anything. There's going to be an issue if there's a crack to break DRM, because usually somebody who does that is going to not just do it out of the quote-unquote goodness of their heart, leave a back door in there so they can gain access to your stuff. And then ransomware, of course, just locks your machine and tries to get you to pay out some kind of ransom, usually in Bitcoin or other untraceable currencies. Denial of service attacks, like DDoS, we talked about that a little bit earlier, and then botnets, of course. That's a big thing with Trojans, is that they will usually dump some kind of command and control software into your computer so that it can sit dormant and wait until a command comes in from a control server to trigger a botnet to carry out some particular task. Some controls that we can use to help defend against that would be malware scanners, so antivirus, anti-malware. Secure shell, like I said, is an acceptable substitute to move over from telnet, unencrypted. PGP, pretty good privacy, uses the GNU platform for open source software to try and enhance encryption for hard drives generally. And then we have secure multipurpose internet mail extension, or SMIME, obviously email. Here we have the layout of the controls as it relates to each individual piece of the TCP model. So we can see again with the physical layer, host layer, and application layer that there's some overlap, because again, if we were to granulate this out to OSI, we would see some very different layouts there. We can see IPsec covers pretty much everything from layer 1 to layer 3. We can see that there's authentication stuff in the top right of layer 4, so SSH, Kerberos, TACACS, all of those items consolidate fairly well. And again, I think this illustrates something that's important about both the TCP model and OSI model. It allows us to kind of compartmentalize where different things function, so that if we have an improvement to one item, it doesn't negatively affect other items in the same general proximity. So that is our chapter 2. So we talked about OSI, we talked about TCP, we talked about protocols, how they're used, and some common attacks. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.